Paul says submit to the governing authorities. Every one of them is appointed by God, and to resist them is to resist God himself. Peter says we must obey God rather than men. Both of those sentences are in your Bible. The tradition did not pretend they weren't both there. It built a framework for holding them. That framework is what this video is about, not a political argument, not a call to resist or a call to comply. What the tradition actually produced, the precise taxonomy it worked out across centuries, tested in documented lives, and left in the record for exactly the moment you are in right now. Because here is what that moment actually feels like, and it's worth naming it directly. You are someone who has spent your life taking the obligations of faith seriously. You know Romans 13. You've honored those above you, even when it cost you. And now the institution you gave decades to has made a series of quiet adjustments, each one defensible in isolation. And you look up and it is no longer the thing you were defending. And you do not know whether what you're feeling is conscience or stubbornness, faithfulness or pride. You don't have a framework for the difference. The tradition does. It has for 800 years. The place to begin is not with a principle, it's with a text. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, working through the question of whether human law binds in conscience, wrote the sentence that the entire subsequent discussion turns on. In the Summa Theologica, he asked whether an unjust law is still a law in any meaningful sense. His answer was precise. A law derives its binding force from its participation in the eternal law. That is, from its justice, its proper origin in competent authority, and its orientation toward the common good. A law that fails these conditions does not bind the conscience. It is, in his formulation, an act of violence rather than a law. That sentence is not a permission slip for general rebellion. Aquinas was not writing a manifesto for disobedience. He was drawing a line, carefully, technically, in the tradition's own terms, between the kinds of authority that can make a claim on the conscience and the kinds that cannot. What he was describing is a taxonomy. 3 distinct kinds of authority, 3 kinds of obedience, and 1 absolute limit that none of them can cross. The first kind is temporal authority, the ordinary authority of civil government over the matters within its proper competence. Roads, courts, taxes, the keeping of order. Paul's instruction in Romans 13 operates here. This authority is real. It is God-ordained in the tradition's account, and the appropriate response to it is obedience, not grudging compliance, obedience. The tradition does not romanticize rebellion against Caesar. Refusing to pay taxes because you disagree with the government's policies is not conscience. The tradition is clear on this. The second kind is institutional authority, the authority of the church as a structured body, with its offices, its councils, its bishops, and its teaching. This is a different register than temporal authority. It is not the authority of Caesar over the public square, but the authority of a body constituted for a specific purpose over its own members. The obedience it calls for is also real. And it is also not absolute. An institution can fail its own constituting purpose. An institution can speak where it has no warrant. The tradition does not teach that institutional loyalty and faithfulness are the same thing. The third kind is not a kind of authority at all, in the ordinary sense. It is conscience. And the tradition's use of that word is precise enough that it is worth stopping on. Conscience, in Aquinas and in the tradition that follows him, is not a feeling. It is not an intuition. It is not personal preference given a religious name. Conscience is the apprehension of the moral law by the rational creature. It is the voice of a law one did not write, arriving through reason, binding whether it is welcomed or not. When Aquinas says that an unjust law does not bind in conscience, he does not mean it does not bind you emotionally. He means it does not bind the rational creature in the place where the creature is finally and irreducibly responsible. This is the category that temporal authority cannot touch and that institutional authority cannot override. And the tradition's claim, stated with great care, is that when any human authority issues a command that requires the violation of what conscience apprehends as the moral law, that authority has exceeded its competence. It has made a demand that is not, in the tradition's technical sense, a law at all. This is not radicalism, this is the main line. From Augustine to Aquinas to More to Newman, the tradition has held this structure. The 3 categories. The 1 absolute limit. What it has not always known is what this costs. Thomas More spent most of his adult life inside the first two categories. This is the part of his story that the popular version, the film, the play, the legend, consistently smooths past. He was a lawyer, a judge, a servant of the crown for decades. He held the highest legal office in England, Lord Chancellor, and he served it faithfully and with distinction. He paid his taxes. He sat on the King's Council. He used the instruments of royal power when he was required to. More was not a man who distrusted the authority of the temporal order. He worked inside it, defended it, and helped constitute it. He also held, inside the same life, a deep loyalty to the institutional church. He went to daily mass. He wore a hair shirt under his chancellor's robes, a documented detail that runs in exactly the opposite direction of performance. He wrote against the reformers who were dismantling the institutional church's authority on the continent. He was, by any reasonable account, among the most faithful institutional men in England. The crisis did not come because More had a suspicious relationship with authority. It came because one specific demand exceeded what the tradition's third category, conscience, could permit. The Oath of Supremacy of 1534 required him to affirm explicitly that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England. More resigned the chancellorship in 1532 when the king's campaign against Rome's authority became clear. He said nothing publicly. He withdrew into private life. He continued to honor the temporal order. He did not preach, organize, or recruit. He attended, quietly, to his family and his books. When the oath arrived, he refused to take it. And then he said nothing more. The Treason Act of 1534 made it a capital offense to deny, in words, the king's supremacy. More had spent 30 years reading statutes. He understood what the act required. It required words, an explicit denial. So he gave it silence. Not because silence was safe. His judges, his family, and the king himself understood perfectly well what his silence meant, but because the law, read with precision, required a spoken denial to constitute treason. He was not hiding behind silence. He was refusing to provide the state with a weapon the law had not yet given it. He was applying the taxonomy. The temporal authority had competence over his body, his property, his office, his liberty. It did not have competence over the specific affirmation it was asking for. The institutional church, the gathered bishops, the councils, the tradition he had spent his life defending, had no authority to demand that he affirm what he believed was false about the church's constitution. And his conscience, which the tradition defines not as his private preference, but as his apprehension of the moral law, had given him a verdict on the question that no human court could revise. The three categories were clear to him. The one limit was clear. It is worth pausing on what we cannot know. More's letters from the Tower, written to his daughter Margaret in 1534 and 35, do not present a man without fear. He wrote about his terror explicitly. He did not pretend the situation was other than what it was. What the record does not give us, and what is important to mark, is access to his interior certainty. We know he held his position. We know the reasoning that, from everything in the record, supported it. What his experience of holding it felt like, from the inside, is inference. The letters suggest a man who was afraid and who held anyway. That is the most honest formulation the record supports. Before going further, there is something the video cannot do, and a resource built specifically to address the gap. More thought about death every day. This is documented, not as temperament, but as practice, a deliberate discipline he maintained throughout his life and that his prison writings make explicit. What the taxonomy gave him for the question of authority, the daily meditation on death, gave him for the question of what holds when everything else is stripped away. Those are related disciplines. They may be the same discipline, approached from different angles. The Memento Mori practice is a 30-day reflection guide built on More's documented practice, daily prompts, primary text excerpts from his prison writings, and reflection questions designed for someone who senses they should be thinking about death seriously but doesn't know how to begin. More thought about this every day. The guide invites you to try it for 30. The link is in the description. Now to the contrast that the popular version almost never examines, because it is uncomfortable, and because the popular version wants a clean hero. When Henry moved against Rome, he required the bishops of England to take the oath. Most of them did. Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury, signed. The overwhelming majority of the English episcopate, the institutional church that More had spent his life defending, went with the king. Some of them believed it. Some of them calculated the odds. Some of them, in the record, showed every sign of knowing exactly what they were doing and doing it anyway. They survived. The institution survived. The Church of England was constituted, largely, by men who had made the choice that more refused. 5 centuries later, that institution is not the institution they were defending when they signed. The tradition was not preserved by the men who bent the oath. It was not destroyed by the one man who refused it. What survived when the institution survived by signing was the institution's structures, its offices, its buildings, its continuity of form. What it became is a different question, and a question the tradition's own taxonomy is designed to help you ask. This is not a point about Anglicanism. It is a point about institutions. An institution that preserves itself by crossing the third category, by making the demand on conscience that the tradition says no human authority can make, does not thereby preserve what it was. It preserves the form. What it was constituted to hold is another matter. The viewer who has watched a church or a denomination make a series of quiet adjustments, each defensible in isolation, until the thing it once defined itself against is now the thing it affirms. That viewer is looking at a version of this same dynamic. The tradition has a name for what happened. It has been happening since 1534. The bishops who signed thought they were saving the church. They saved something. More was brought to trial on July 1st, 1535. The prosecution needed what his silence had refused to give it, an explicit denial of the king's supremacy. Richard Rich, Solicitor General, testified that More had made such a denial in a private conversation in the Tower. More's response is recorded in the trial transcript. He did not argue the substance of the accusation, he dismantled the witness. He pointed to Rich's character and reputation with the precision of a man who had spent his career evaluating testimony. He noted that Rich had been known, throughout his life, as a man whose oath could not be relied upon. He stated, with directness, that it was almost inconceivable that he would have said, to a man of Rich's character, the thing Rich claimed he said. The verdict was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for 15 minutes. More was condemned on the 6th of July, 1535. He was taken to the scaffold on Tower Hill. Roper, who was present, records what happened. As More mounted the scaffold, he was weak. He had been in the Tower for over a year, and his health had deteriorated. The lieutenant helped him up. More turned to him and said, regarding his beard, that it at least had committed no treason, and asked him to clear it to one side before the axe fell. This is the moment the popular version reads as courage performing itself. The witty martyr, brave in the face of death, making the crowd smile. Read it again. The joke is addressed to a single man, a functionary helping him mount the platform. There is no audience to perform for. There is only a man going about a small piece of bureaucratic business, helping the condemned man position himself, and another man making a quiet, dry, almost private observation about his beard. That is not performance. That is a man whose interior state has been separated from the exterior situation. The scaffold cannot reach where he lives. What the tradition's third category, conscience, properly understood, is supposed to produce in a life is not fearlessness. It is not a performance of certainty. It is this, a self that the machinery of the temporal order cannot finally get to. A place inside the person where the state's demand has no jurisdiction. His last words, as the record has them, I die the king's good servant and God's first. The taxonomy, in 11 words. The temporal authority acknowledged he was the king's good servant. He had been his whole adult life. And then the absolute limit, stated without drama, in 2 words, God's first. Not God's only, not God instead of the king. The distinction is exact, the framework is intact. The 3 categories are honored. The one limit is named. That is what the tradition built. That is what the record shows it producing, under the maximum pressure available. Here is what the tradition is not saying, and it matters to be honest about it. It is not saying the conscience is infallible. Conscience can be malformed, underdeveloped, or distorted. The tradition is very clear on this, which is why it insists that conscience must be formed, not merely followed. More's conscience was formed by decades of reading, prayer, and serious engagement with the texts of the church. He was not following a feeling. He was following the apprehension of the moral law by a reason that had been trained to apprehend it. The tradition is also not saying that the line is always clear. The bishops who signed were not all cynical. Some of them reasoned their way to a different conclusion than More did. The tradition acknowledges that reasonable men, equally formed, can land in different places on hard questions. What it does not acknowledge, what the record shows more refusing to acknowledge, is that the pressure of the institution's survival is a legitimate reason to cross the line. The bishops who signed because the institution needed to survive were not applying the taxonomy, they were collapsing it. And the tradition is not saying that holding the line always produces visible results. More died. Fisher died. The institutional Church of England was constituted without them. What the tradition is saying is something more austere, that the decision to cross the third category is not rescued by what the institution becomes afterward. Survival is not vindication. The question that this video cannot resolve, and that is worth naming before the close, is the question you came with. Not, what did more do, but what do I do? The taxonomy gives you tools. It does not give you the answer for your specific institution, your specific denomination, your specific congregation, your specific family. It gives you the structure with which to ask the question seriously. That is not a small thing. Most people facing what you are facing do not have even the structure. They are feeling their way toward a line without knowing that the tradition has a name for what they are feeling toward, has tested that name in documented lives, and has left the record for exactly this kind of moment. The tradition's answer to the question, where does obedience end, is not wherever you decide, and it is not wherever the institution tells you. It is something more demanding than either. There is a law you did not write, which your reason can apprehend, which no human authority can require you to violate. And the work of the Christian life, in the tradition's account, is to form the conscience capable of hearing it clearly enough to know when it has spoken. Moore formed his over 30 years. The scaffold joke is the evidence of what that formation produced. Not courage, which can be performed, but a separated interior, which cannot be faked in the moment of maximum pressure. The question that remains is not whether the framework is true, it has been tested. The question is whether you are willing to do the work of formation that makes it usable, and what that will cost when the demand finally arrives. The full account is in the record. It has been there since 1535. The question of whether you will go looking for it, that one belongs to you. If you have watched an institution you gave years to cross a line, it once defined itself against, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet adjustments until the thing it was defending was no longer there. Name it, if you're willing. Not the institution's name. The conviction they traded,